Saladin and the fall of Jerusalem. The summer of 1187 was brutally hot. The Crusader army had marched into difficult terrain. Saladin's forces were nearby. The Crusader leadership faced a dangerous decision: stay where they were, or march toward the enemy. They chose to advance. That decision became disastrous. Saladin's army controlled the surrounding water sources. The Crusaders were thirsty. Their horses were exhausted. The heat became unbearable. Muslim forces harassed them from multiple directions. Smoke filled the air. The Crusaders struggled to maintain formation. Eventually, the army became trapped near the horns of Hattin. On July 4, 1187, Saladin's forces destroyed the Crusader army. Thousands were killed or captured. Among the prisoners was King Guy of Lusignan. One of the most important relics of the Crusader army, the True Cross, was also captured. The defeat destroyed the military power protecting Jerusalem, and Saladin knew exactly what to do next. He advanced toward the city. The defenders understood their situation. There was no realistic field army coming to rescue them. Negotiations began. Jerusalem surrendered on October 2, 1187, but the events inside the city were very different from those of 1099. Saladin did not repeat the massacre. Instead, inhabitants were allowed to leave after paying ransoms, although many poor people struggled to afford them. Some were eventually released. The city had changed hands again. For Christians in Europe, the loss of Jerusalem was devastating. A new crusade was inevitable. This became the Third Crusade. Three of the most powerful rulers in Europe became involved: Frederick Barbarossa, Philip I of France, and Richard I of England. Richard would become known as Richard the Lionheart. The German emperor chose the overland route. His army crossed Europe and Anatolia, but disaster struck. In 1190, Frederick drowned while crossing the Salaf River. His death shattered the morale of his army. Many soldiers turned back. Richard and Philip traveled by sea. Richard captured Cyprus on the way. The island would become strategically important for the Crusader movement. Then Richard reached the Levant. The siege of Acre became the central event. Acre was heavily defended. The Crusaders surrounded it from land. Their fleet blocked the harbor. After months of fighting, the city surrendered. But Richard and Saladin were still far from agreement. Richard's army marched south. At Arsuf, the Crusaders won a major battle. Richard proved to be an exceptional military commander, but he still faced a fundamental problem. Jerusalem was too far inland. Even if he captured the city, could he defend it? Saladin's armies could surround it. The Crusaders might take Jerusalem only to lose it again. Richard therefore faced an agonizing choice. Victory was possible, but perhaps not sustainable. In 1192, negotiations produced the Treaty of Jaffa. The Crusaders retained parts of the coastline. Christian pilgrims could visit Jerusalem, but Jerusalem itself remained under Muslim control. Richard never became the conqueror of Jerusalem, yet his campaign demonstrated something important. The Crusades were not simply a battle between two civilizations. Both sides contained diplomats, merchants, soldiers, politicians, and religious leaders. Richard and Saladin never met personally in the romantic way later legends sometimes suggest. Their relationship was largely conducted through messengers and negotiation. And after Richard returned to Europe, the struggle continued. But the meaning of the Crusades was changing. They were no longer limited to Jerusalem. The idea of crusading began to spread into other conflicts, and eventually, Crusaders would turn their weapons against fellow Christians. That would lead to one of the most shocking episodes of the Middle Ages, the Fourth Crusade. When Crusaders attacked Christianity by the beginning of the 13th century, Europe had become accustomed to the idea of crusading, but the target could now be almost anywhere. Muslims in the Holy Land, pagans in the Baltic, heretics in southern France, and eventually, Orthodox Christians in Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade began with a relatively straightforward plan. The Crusaders intended to reach the eastern Mediterranean by sea. They needed ships. Venice agreed to provide them. But when the Crusaders assembled, far fewer soldiers had arrived than expected. The expedition could not pay Venice the full amount. The Venetians offered another solution: help them capture Zara. Zara was a Christian city, yet in 1202, the Crusaders attacked it. The Pope had forbidden the assault, but the attack went ahead, and then an even stranger opportunity appeared. A Byzantine prince named Alexios approached the Crusaders. He promised enormous rewards if they helped him reclaim the imperial throne in Constantinople. Money, military support, and religious concessions. The Crusaders accepted. Their expedition, originally intended for the Holy Land, now moved toward Constantinople. In 1203, the Crusaders arrived outside the greatest Christian city in the eastern Mediterranean. The walls of Constantinople were enormous. The city had survived invasions for centuries, but political instability weakened it. The Crusaders eventually helped place Alexios IV on the throne, but he could not fulfill his promises. Tensions exploded. In 1204, the Crusaders attacked Constantinople. For 3 days, the city was looted. Churches were robbed. Palaces were destroyed. People were killed. Relics and treasures were carried away. The damage was enormous. One of the most famous examples was the set of bronze horses from the Hippodrome. The Venetians transported them to Venice. They eventually became associated with St. Mark's Basilica. The Byzantine Empire was shattered. A Latin empire was established in Constantinople. Greek successor states emerged elsewhere. The Byzantine rulers eventually returned to the city in 1261, but the empire never fully recovered. This event had consequences far beyond the Crusades. The relationship between Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic Christianity became even more bitter. The Byzantine Empire was weakened. Venice gained enormous commercial advantages, and the Muslim powers of the region were given time to strengthen. The Fourth Crusade therefore became one of history's great unintended disasters. The Crusaders had set out to fight for Jerusalem. Instead, they conquered Constantinople. The event also demonstrates why the word crusade cannot simply be understood as one continuous war. The movement had evolved. Popes could now declare crusades against political enemies, against heretics, against pagan peoples, even against other Christians. In southern France, the Albigensian Crusade targeted the Cathars. The campaign lasted for years. Entire towns were destroyed. Thousands died. The same spiritual rewards offered to crusaders traveling to the Holy Land could be offered to those fighting enemies within Europe. Meanwhile, in Iberia, Christian kingdoms continued their centuries-long struggle against Muslim states, and in the Baltic region, military orders fought pagan peoples. The crusading movement had become an ideology of warfare, but the Holy Land remained at the center of its imagination, and new expeditions continued. Some were led by kings, others by emperors. One of the most unusual was led by Frederick I. He had been excommunicated by the Pope, yet he spoke Arabic and had a deep interest in Islamic culture. Instead of launching a massive military assault, Frederick negotiated. In 1229, he obtained control of Jerusalem through diplomacy. It was a remarkable achievement. A Crusader emperor had recovered Jerusalem without a major battle, but the victory was temporary. The political situation in the Muslim world changed again, and a new power was approaching: the Mongols. The Mongols, the Mamluks, and a changing world during the 13th century. Another force appeared on the eastern horizon: the Mongols. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, Mongol armies conquered enormous territories. Their empire eventually stretched across much of Eurasia. Cities fell. Kingdoms disappeared. Trade routes were transformed. The Mongols were feared as unstoppable warriors. Their armies were highly mobile. They could travel enormous distances. They used composite bows from horseback, and their military organization was extraordinarily disciplined. But the Mongol Empire was not simply a machine of destruction. The conquest also created one of the largest connected political spaces in history. Merchants could travel from China toward Europe through territories controlled by Mongol rulers. Ideas and technologies moved across Eurasia. Yet in the Middle East, the Mongol expansion was devastating. In 1258, Baghdad was captured. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had existed for centuries, was destroyed. For Christian Europe, the Mongols created a strange possibility. Some Mongol elites belonged to Christian communities of the Church of the East. European rulers began imagining an alliance. Perhaps the Mongols could destroy the Muslim powers threatening the Crusader States. But this alliance never became the solution Europe hoped for. Instead, another power emerged in Egypt: the Mamluks. Mamluks were military slaves who had been trained as elite soldiers. Over time, they became powerful enough to seize political control. In 1250, the Mamluks overthrew the Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt. Their most famous leader would become Sultan Baybars. Baybars understood the strategic importance of the Crusader territories. But first, he had to deal with the Mongols. In 1260, the Mongols invaded the Levant. They seemed unstoppable, but near Ain-Jalut, the Mamluks defeated them. It was a turning point. The Mongol advance into the Middle East had been halted. Baybars then turned his attention toward the Crusader States. One fortress after another came under attack. Castles that had stood for generations were surrounded. The Crusader territories became smaller. Their armies became weaker. Their allies in Europe were increasingly distracted by their own wars. The last major Crusader stronghold was Acre. By 1291, the situation was desperate. The Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil arrived with a huge army. The siege began. The defenders fought desperately. The walls were attacked repeatedly. Siege engines battered the fortifications. Eventually, the city fell. The fall of Acre marked the effective end of the Crusader States in the Holy Land. After almost 2 centuries, the experiment of creating permanent European kingdoms in the Middle East had collapsed. But the story of the Crusades was not finished. The military orders survived. The Knights Hospitaller moved to Cyprus and later established themselves on Rhodes. The Templars were destroyed as a political organization. Their sudden downfall would later create some of the most famous legends in medieval history. People would claim that the Templars possessed secret treasures, ancient relics, hidden knowledge, even the Holy Grail. But most of these stories appeared much later and are not supported by solid historical evidence. The reality is fascinating enough. The Templars had become extraordinarily wealthy. They owned land across Europe. They had political enemies. And in 1307, King Philip of France moved against them. The order was eventually suppressed. Its possessions were redistributed. The Pope formally dissolved the organization in 1312. But one thing remained: the memory of the Crusades. And that memory would become more powerful than the wars themselves.